Okay. If everyone could please stand up, please stand up. It is the main event of the evening. So, the man I'm about to introduce on stage to you, hopefully he's mic'd up and ready. Could you make sure that's done at the back? Went from humble beginnings, just like most of his rock and roll and sports friends, to world stardom. He became a rock star at a young age. If I were to be in a second life, I'd love to be a rock star. He is a hugely successful entrepreneur with many, many companies. Many people don't know about his huge entrepreneurial ventures. He has many companies. He'll be telling you about some of those later on. He's one of the world's best known activists. He has a large, diverse business and property portfolio. He's raised billions of pounds for charity and been nominated for the Nobel Peace I'm getting so excited about this. The Nobel Peace Prize 7 freaking times. Please put your hands together, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Bob Geldof.
Thank you. Mark didn't tell me it was like one of that, you know, that movie that Tom Cruise does where he talks about his knob the whole time. Do you have to shout at people? I mean, your fucking shirt is loud enough, dude. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, I'm a mega rock and roll superstar. And that was one of my great tracks you just heard when I came on. It was a lot of drums, but cool. I associate Wembley, of course, with not property, but with Live Aid and stuff that happened up here. And in fact, I was at the opening of this stadium to see my team win the FA Cup. There's not much more I can say about Chelsea these days, though. They're unlikely to see this place for a long time. I don't know what I can say to guys who are engaged in property, save that we all are. At one point in our lives, it's an almost primal human need, which is, I suppose, where you people can make your money and your profit, and nothing wrong with that. Neither money nor profit, they're both amoral agents. It depends on how you make it and what you do with it in the end. But I don't even have a checkered history with property. I sort of moved seamlessly from homelessness to having somewhere quite nice to live. I was just saying to Rob upstairs that it's a tough old world out there. My dad died last year. My dad sold towels around the countryside of Ireland for most of his life. Not much money in that. My mum died when I was 6 or 7. And my dad would go away on a Monday and come back on a Friday. And we had a flat. And then he made the big breakout in 1961. He'd saved up a bit. And he bought this old Victorian house for 600 quid. He died last year, and by the time he died, he had 3 houses. Number 18 and number 20, the one beside it. And then an old coach house at the back, which he transformed in his dotage into something that Corbusier or Mies van der Rohe would have been proud of. He suddenly turned into this steel and glass guy. But he died thinking that from selling towels around the countryside of Ireland, he left his 2 daughters and his son 6 million euros, of which understandably he was deeply proud. we couldn't bear to tell him that in the last year of his life, that 6 million euros have been reduced to 500 euros values each. My dad ended up giving me a house, a wonderful house, worth 500,000. He didn't understand that. He was 96. The fact is that nobody understands it. Nobody truly understands what really happened to the world. And what happened to the world was property gone sour. I mean, I bore people to death about the poor, normally about Africa. That poverty itself is such a ludicrous proposition. Poverty itself is such a ludicrous proposition. Why would you possibly have poverty? When I first encountered the conditions of poverty in Ireland, it again had something allied to property. When I encountered it in its starkest and most horrific sense in Africa, and some of you are of an age when you remember the great famines of the mid-80s that we all responded to. It was the housing of those people that was one of the predominant issues in northern Ethiopia back in the mid-80s. And I visited these stinking silos of death, these overheated, corrugated sheds, silent but for the moans and occasional shrieks of agony that starvation is, and the sound of flies everywhere. Housing the dying was a problem. And then there was the housing of all the people on the move. But all of them needed to be housed. See, it's not property that you're dealing with ultimately, is it? It's something visceral, something essential. We need food, we need water. We desire them because we need them. And when you desire something, it becomes a weakness. You can be exploited. Because the person who holds the bottle of water or the loaf of bread can demand whatever from you. And the need to be sheltered goes to the heart of what it is to be human. Indeed, it goes to the heart of what it is to be an animal. A cow will seek shelter, as will a sheep. The problem is we're cursed with self-awareness. A cow doesn't understand that its name is Daisy or Mabel. It's just, moo, I'm a cow. We know what we are. And we always ask the big question, what's it all about? The $64 billion existential question, what does it all mean? What's it for? Well, in a word, shagging. Reproduction. That's what we're compelled to do. And from whatever I've read about housing and property, I haven't read a lot, but I was involved with the United Nations team, the woman who was the Secretary General of the United Nations housing teams for the giant cities of the 21st century, clever woman, Anna Tabajuka. It was always women, and still is, who determine housing. Most property guys, and you or they, will tell you that if the woman decides not on the house, then it won't be bought or rented, and will move to somewhere that she likes. And the men just generally go along with it. Why? Because she needs shelter for the children, and we do too. So in that primal need is the source of your wealth to be or your current wealth. And it gets perverted, not by you necessarily, but by the agents of money. The poor in Dublin, who I worked with when I was 15 and 16, and the poor of Africa, who I work with still, are manipulated. As you know right now, by the appalling behavior of the world banks. The poor caused this catastrophic financial situation. Be under no illusion, as I'm sure you're not, as you probably have to deal with it every day, how serious the situation we're in is. We've almost become inured to an understanding of what it is we're in. Last year, we all were frightened, stupid by the headlines. And now, crisis is the new normal. We're a bit bored by it. But could be a month, 2 months, whatever, it goes seriously pear-shaped. Greece will default. It will default. It mightn't be tomorrow now, might be 3 months, but probably 2013. What the EU has done was buy time for an orderly default and exit from the Eurozone, which may not be as catastrophic as if they just fell out. But if there's an unraveling from that point, then Britain's in trouble, serious trouble. And the people who are hit most by this behavior are the poor, as always. We saw it in America. We saw it with this farcical world Ponzi scheme, which was the global economy. And somebody called the tune. Somebody said, can you pay me back for that crap house that I sold to that poor person who told you they couldn't get a job, who never had a job, who will never have a job, who can't pay back. Yet you gave them the money, 100%. Somebody wanted to be paid back. And like a piece of wool being pulled from a jumper, it unraveled before we could blink. Subprime is the result of exploiting the poor. The poor called the tune. They brought the world down around our ears. Bizarrely, property again brought it back, or stabilized it. The great poor of China, in their 400 million droves, one of the great triumphs of the beginning of our century is the pulling of 400 million Chinese out of extreme poverty. There's still 800 million more to go, and we were talking about that upstairs. That's what the Chinese government is focused intensely on. If they are not pulled out of poverty, there will be revolution there. So forget any global ambitions of the Chinese. They mean it when they say, we're not interested in other people's stuff. Give us enough raw materials to produce. We'll keep holding US dollars, but we've got to focus on the 800 million extreme poor in our country, or else the whole thing's going to blow up. And they're right. But the 400 million that in the last 10 years were pulled out of extreme poverty through trade all wanted to be housed. What happened? Well, this created an inflationary bubble. And the housing was paid for by massive loans from the Chinese government, subprime. Now, the Chinese government doesn't necessarily have to be paid back. But behind all this also are international banks lending. So while the poor of China stabilized, they created an inflationary bubble for China and slowed down the pace of their growth, which we really can't afford. So it's the poor. And it's the poor of this country. I was playing rock and roll in a tour here before Christmas. Now, I know a lot of you are from all over the country, but inside London, it doesn't feel too bad. Outside, it's sad beyond belief. This should not be happening to this country. Opportunity should not be taken from those children now leaving schools. A lost generation, at least. Well, we can't afford that. And who's going to rent the properties you're going to buy? Who's going to house this lost generation? You are, because you're entrepreneurs. The entire reason you're here is because as individuals, you've got that other thing going on about creating an own life. Another Irish skeptic, George Bernard Shaw, said, all change comes through the power of unreasonable people. The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable persists in adapting the world to himself. You may not know it, but that's what you're doing. You're trying to create an own universe for yourself in which you can be comfortable, where you can determine your own life, where you can make enough money to do what you want to do. Because you don't want necessarily to be working for the banks or the this or the that. No, you want to do your own thing. You are unreasonable by definition, and all change comes through the power of this unreason. First, you change your own life, and then others are changed. Gandhi, my great hero, said first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. That's absolutely true, except as my friend says, in your case, Geldof, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you. The end. So it's odd. I'm not trying to tailor my experience to this room. The truth is, the global economic crisis was caused by property. The stabilization of the crash was caused by poor people needing property in China. And 4 days ago, I was in Berlin. Now, I was talking to Mark on the phone before I did this, and we just got into a general conversation. I said, why is there this casino idea of property in our country? Why does that happen? Why did we decide that housing would be the general path to growth in the economy and to individual wealth? What happened here that we look at a house not as a primary source of shelter, this primal need? We still do that. If somebody breaks into your house, we talk about being violated. We talk about feeling raped. We talk about it as the most intimate thing, this little rectangle of brick, which is the entire world reduced to a square space. Someone gets in there, they're getting into your head. I wrote a song once in the Boomtown Rats. I think the line is, home is where the head is. Home is where the demons all come out to play. Home is where you hide yourself at night. Home is where you feel safe. And I wrote it in the wake of being burgled in the first house I ever bought, which was in Clapham. And it was a small terraced house, but I was so young, I guess, I had money enough. I was a pop star. 18 months before, I was on the dole queue in Dunleary in South Dublin. I had my own house. It was inconceivable. But I was on top of the pops, and so the yahoos and the estates nearby targeted us, and myself and Paula spent most of our time repelling boarders at 8 in the evening. But I wrote that song in the middle of that, and I said, someone broke into his house last night. It's strange they didn't take a thing, because they didn't. They just broke in. And then the next line I said, someone broke into his house last night. It's strange, but it feels like they took everything. So this space that we call property is sacred to the individual. This is where all human drama is played out. The hatred, the love, the reproduction, the memories. When people fuck with that, they mess with us. So when you guys buy our properties and you rent them out, someone isn't buying a brick. They're buying some space in which all of their life will be contained. There's a great responsibility in that. This game you're in has great responsibilities to the economy, to society, to the individuals. Rob and Mark were saying that they've got properties up in Peterborough. I was asking about the people who are housed there, what they like. Do you ever have problem families? I was very surprised because for people who dress so badly, they were... Have you seen those ridiculous cowboy boots? Embarrassing. But then again, they do own property in Peterborough. And they were very kind about the people. They may not think so, but they were in no way superior. They had problems, and there was someone there who'd been homeless, who'd been in housing, council housing, who understood the problems and could take care of it. I told you that when I was a kid, around 15, 16, I started working with the homeless in Dublin. I did that because, like a lot of people, I was rubbish, useless at school. There was no one at home to make me do my homework. And so I just stopped going home. There was nobody at home. As I said, my mother was dead, my dad was away, so I just went into Dublin, into the centre of Dublin, most days after school. And I kind of did it because it was the mid-60s and I'd been listening to people you know about, Bob Dylan. I've been reading John Steinbeck, Woody Guthrie, Studs Terkel, the kind of romance of poverty, except there is no romance in poverty. And I began to hang with a crowd called the Simon community, which sounds like a religious thing, but it wasn't. And they looked after the sort of hookers and the lonely and the homeless and the dispossessed men and women. And they do very simple things like we gather vegetables from the grocers at 6 o'clock. All of the stuff that hadn't sold, they'd give to us. And at about 2 in the morning, the bakers would begin baking the next day's bread, and they'd bake extra loaves for us. And we gathered them up, and we'd go to Smithfield Market in Dublin, build a fire, make some soup with all this stuff, and all these people would gather round. And here were these books I've been reading, almost romantically about America, these vivid names. But it was happening on my doorstep. These weren't the hookers of Hollywood imagination. These were pale, thin stick girls with rags for clothes, beaten up by their pimps. In one instance, because one of them asked me, could she have an orange squash? And the men had fallen out of their families, lost their jobs, got drunk. But what we would do is, once we'd sat around the fire and they'd had their soup, we'd fill up our flasks and walk around Dublin. We all had a sort of route. And one of the people I remember very well, at the time I thought she was an old lady. I suppose now I'd recognize her as being in her 40s, but being homeless, she could have been any age. And she lived in the porch, the doorway of an okay house, nothing great. And I'd go there most evenings and she'd be there huddled up in her cardboard boxes and, you know, a bag lady in effect, a schizophrenic. She was highly literate. And I remember, I suppose, what she said to me because it was quite lyrical the way she spoke. It had rhythm in it. And I said to her once, Mary, look, you know, do you want to get a hand to try and get into a home or something like that? She said, no. She chose to live like this because she never wanted to hear the slap of the electric bill on the whole tile floor. Stuck with me. And so we chatted and she stank. That didn't bother me. And I'd walk away and this teenage boy would be filled with this enraged passion, as all teenagers are, thinking about the man who owned that house, coming back of an evening, and here's this sentient, intelligent, human being in his doorway, stepping over, slamming the door in her face. And this enraged me, and I probably spouted some anarchist nonsense about all property is theft, etc. Later, of course, still thinking of this in my 20s, I understood that this man came home every evening, saw this woman, probably said, "Good evening, Mary," stepped over her and closed the door. Would I do that? And the answer was shocking to me. No, I wouldn't. This guy didn't get the police to clear her off his doorstep. He didn't think about the value of his property being diminished. He gave her the dignity of acknowledging a human being, and he let her live in the place she chose to be. And that was her property. So when I pitched up in Peterborough on the night that Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, and fucking Peterborough was more extraordinary than landing on the moon, I'm going to tell you that. It was no dogs, no blacks, no Irish. So I made a point of going to that house. Clearly Irish. This Italian answered the door. And it was, I think, 30 bob in advance. Whatever. I gave it to him, and that's where I was with this stupid fat son picking his nose, looking at the television the whole night. I worked up in the pea canning factory. I worked on the night shifts. But before I got that job, I forgot to tell you, lads, I got a job wiring the new shopping centre in Peterborough in 1969. I hadn't a fucking clue. I'd never changed a plug in my life. It took them 2 weeks to twig. I've been there blasting away at the ceiling, sticking fluorescents in, pretending I could understand the diagrams. The place probably burnt down, but that's absolutely true. I came to London, and I heard, being Irish, through the grapevine, there was great work to be had on building the M23-25. So those of you who land at Gatwick now in the coming summer and you have to get onto the 25, that junction at Merstham is Geldof interchange. It is the place where most accidents occur, because the camber is slightly off, but there you go. I slept in Gatwick Airport for 3 months. What was his Tom Hanks like? I was going to get a place, and I was in Godstone looking at B&Bs, and I thought, no, fuck it, I'd sleep out here for free, nobody notice, save the money. And I lived there for 3 months, so I'm just advising you now, it's great. Mortgage your own place, buy somewhere in Peterborough, I slept out there because it had bathrooms, it had showers, it had cafes, you could find a spot where there were no flights and you could move around so they didn't catch you. After the summer, I'd saved up, I moved into town. And because of what I'd done in the Simon community, I lived on the street. I was homeless. But that sounds ridiculous, because I could have gone back to Ireland, so I wasn't homeless. But again, I chose to do that. I didn't have a job, didn't want to spend money. But you're 18, whatever it was, 18, 17. Save up. Eventually, I started sleeping in a crypt in a church in Holborn, which later became the Sex Pistols office. And there was a bunch of people there, and this priest would give us a sponge thing to lie on. And again, I liked the sense of community amongst these actual people who were homeless. I began selling hot dogs on those trolleys and got arrested by the police as much as I could, because Vine Street Police Station was quite comfortable. And eventually I got to live in a squat in Tufnell Park. So I've been through it. The squat was cool. We didn't break in and occupy it. We were kind of welcomed by the landlord. He couldn't rent it. There was some problem with the title deeds. And myself and 2 girls and a bunch of friends were in there. And we were raided a lot by the police. They were looking for drugs. They didn't find them. They were excellent drugs, how dare you? And I went back to Ireland and yada, 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 and I become a pop singer, and I get a house in Clapham, and I'm getting burgled, and I look for somewhere else, and I find this 12th century priory in Kent. Still have it, it's still beautiful. 3p it cost me in 1983 or whatever. Then moved into Chelsea, because now I was getting rich. Then got divorced and was expelled to the divorced man's ghetto of Battersea. I don't know why girls think that's hilarious. I mean, it's the guys are going. I live in Battersea. I love it. I've got a flat. I don't think I'd change, even if I could. And I watch the house market as much as anyone else. The point is that whatever I paid for the flat is worth 3 times what it was. Wow. Except, as you know, to buy a new place at the commensurate level of the flat, I'd have to spend that and more again. So the casino wheel turns. Germany, 4 days ago. Housing is flat. Just outside Berlin is Potsdam, which is like Richmond to London, extremely beautiful, fabulous housing. You can get a mega place. I mean, absolutely beautiful. We're talking 12, 14 million here. Less than €1 million. Why? Because the Germans, 80%, 85% of Germans rent. Very few own their houses. It's not a casino property economy. Is that why they're growing at 3.5% and we're flatlining? It's one of the reasons. Because our economy is so dependent on the property market. Theirs has nothing to do with it. It's to do with manufacturing and export. Could we compete? Yeah, we could. Is our manufacturing service sufficient? Yes, it is. 13% of the economy. France is 12%. Is it at a scale and a quality equal to the Germans? Yes, it is, despite what people say. Our workers are just as skilled and just as qualified. They've got 80 million people in Germany, that's the difference, and vast space. And all of them rent. Why? Because the rents are capped by the government. Not something you want to hear. I doubt you'd be rushing over to Berlin tomorrow to buy that mega house. They're capped, and people save their money to spend on other things. They're also able to pass on the flat to their children. So that's why the economy took a different route. It's also, though, why they didn't collapse. So you people are engaged in this entrepreneurial activity that is so central to the core, not just of the economy, but there for the country, but much more importantly, to the people who will live in those houses. Do you care about it? Do you care about them? I guess. You don't want them wrecking your places. And being entrepreneurial, you want to move on and do other things. But the banks won't lend you money. The banks who brought about this mess, who irresponsibly lent in the first place, have destroyed the economy. Still pay themselves these preposterous bonuses. I don't understand why there's any bonuses at all. I don't understand why the market rate is where they say it is. I don't understand why Kravitz from the PE firm KKR got 94.5 million last year. What the fuck did he do that gets 94.5 million? And he can have that if everybody is getting 91 million, but they're not. And the market only works when private reward and social benefits are aligned. If it goes out of kilter, so does everything else. And essentially, these people are non-productive. You will keep the housing industry going. You will borrow, which keeps the banking market going. You are an SME. The classic traction of our economy. But in all other sectors, people like you who are prepared to put their lives, their families' lives, their homes up for grabs just to do what you feel you can make money out of. The banks are refusing them, just like they're possibly refusing other people who want to buy a place. Now, I kind of know about it because my kids are at the point in their life where they want to find their own places and they're earning decent enough money. Can they get a mortgage? You're joking. And this is true of nearly every business in this country. Having been the instruments of our ruin, they now are the instruments of continuing this ruin and stopping growth. And you must know that. I know that Mark has been talking about outside agents that'll loan at 5% or 1% a month or whatever for short-term deals. I don't understand that. I don't want to get into it. That's what you guys have to get into. But I do understand the societal need for you and the societal responsibility you hold by doing your job. And I can't think of a more important time for you to do this job or a more difficult time. Because up in the north, decline. In the south, flat. London, kind of rising. And I tried to look at some statistics to understand what you had to deal with. And I was surprised that there's been a 28% increase in online sales. So that of the total market, 11% is now online. That's people doing what you're doing, but just at home, which must affect you. That loans are completely out. That unemployment, of course, is on the increase. So you're staring into an opportunity in some level, but into an extremely difficult time. And if you guys can take off, then that is a sure indicator the economy will. Like it or not, you're the canaries in the mine. Now, you've been hearing all day about property, about loans, etc. I've just completed raising funds for a private equity group for opportunities in Africa. It took me years to raise $200 million. I decided to do it in 2008 at a conference in China, where they'd asked me to come and speak about the opportunities of Africa, very counterintuitive. And I pointed out to them, why were they looking to invest in China when the Chinese were all over Africa? And people liked the story, and they came afterwards and said, look, you know the continent, why don't you do something down there? I said, I don't understand finance. The CEO said, look, Bob, a lot of our clients are interested. We'll put up $5 million, a seed capital, put it together and try and get investment. I said, I'll do it if your head of Europe comes with me. Much to my dismay, the guy came. You know, nothing more boring than finance. Fucking hell, you know. I mean, people pretend it's difficult. It's absolute rubbish, you know. And I do this stuff because my mind is unstill. You know, I was saying to the guys that a rock and roll band is essentially an entrepreneurial activity. It's the classic SME. A guy wants to play his songs, but he's not a very good guitar player, so he gets his mate who's really good on guitar. This song needs piano. He'll get another mate who's good at piano to do it. And you haven't got a single record in your collection that's got a crap drummer in the band, because if there's a crap drummer, it just doesn't work. So now you've got this company, in effect. And if you can posit the way to go forward in a clear line, with a clear direction and a clear methodology, then these people will come with you and bolster your idea and support it and take it through to the next level. The key point comes when the classic entrepreneur must have the modesty to understand that there are certain skills that are purely entrepreneurial, and stand aside and invite in a manager who has other skills to manage the project. But the entrepreneur himself must keep to the line, straight and true, and still articulating what it is they're supposed to be doing. When that is lost, the band, the company, the property thing will break up. So I went to the banks when I was starting off to try and start a newspaper in Ireland. And I had a beard and long hair, and I wore hippie sort of dungarees. A better look than these two. And I got my mate's dad, who was a big solicitor, another guy I knew was an accountant, and I sat there while they outlined this whiz-bang plot. And the manager just sat there for hours like this with his hands, not listening at all. And the presentation came to an end, and he looked up at me and said, "Tell me now, Mr. Geldof, what age are you?" And I said, 19 or 20 or whatever it was, 20. And he said, "Hey, come back when you're 40. "No, I won't, you fuck." That idea, which was called the buy and sell paper, sold 15 years ago for 35 million euros. Unfortunately, it wasn't mine. I'd left it with the printers because I decided more fun to start a rock and roll band, you know, girls, drugs, boring paper. And the printer I'd left it with ran with the idea. I didn't mind, it was fine. And he sold it for 35 million. And I was really happy because, bang, that I knew that idea would work. I just didn't have the patience, or I wasn't that enamored with it in the first place. So I've always kind of thought like that. I'm going to Washington tomorrow because I've got this this educational technology company that's doing great. And I like all that stuff. I like business. I find it just as creative as the music thing. So all of it works in the same sort of way for me. When I went to Africa with the idea of a PE fund, the first thing I was told was that the most expensive property in the world is not the Champs-Élysées, not the Upper East Side, not Kensington and Chelsea. It's the shoreline of Luanda in Angola. So we come back to where we started. The most expensive property in the planet is Luanda, Angola, a kleptocracy of 17 million of some of the poorest people in the planet. It was a it was a Portuguese colony. The irony is that 10% of the Portuguese unemployed in this current crisis have moved to Angola for work. The irony is the Angolan government is paying the Portuguese debt. Who would have thought? But the most expensive property, Luanda. Why? Because the Chinese economy, which powers the world, is powered through Angola. All the raw materials they need are more or less in that one state. And those 6 guys who run that have become so rich, the only way they can get status now is by investing in roads and schools and hospitals. Weird, I couldn't have predicted it, but that's the way it goes. And when I started this PE fund, which we closed 10 days ago, I'll finish fundraising in 18 months, and we'll close at about 480 million bucks, which sounds a lot, but when you're investing in African industries, it's not much. It's a continent that's on the boil. It's kicking off big time. Half of the population are under 17, moved to the cities, creating vast cities. The retail market there, huge. Real estate, a friend of mine built 6,000 flats in Lagos. They sold in 45 minutes. You will be the people who determine if we come out of this mess well or not, because of the properties you buy and the people you house and shelter will be the determinant of the near future of this country. And as you go into these things, as you try and raise funds from banks that won't lend, who already robbed us, as you try and find money, your own capital, as you try and put up your own lives as collateral, the classic thing that the entrepreneur requires to succeed is the notion of commitment. You know it and I know it. Even in your relationships, being married, having a partner. It's hard. It's hard. You just have to make it work. And when you've committed your lives to this thing you want to do, or a portion of your lives, or a portion of your wealth, it's only commitment. If you don't see it through, you're ruined. And I learned this because in the middle of Live Aid, I was very frightened. I was a pop singer. I decided to do this thing. It had got almost out of control. This phenomenon had occurred. You'd seen what I'd seen. You were disgusted as I was disgusted. You didn't want it to occur in your name, and that little piece of Band-Aid plastic became the focus of all that rage and shame that year. And so I picked up the phone and would ask to speak to Rupert Murdoch, and suddenly there was an Australian on the line, or could I speak to the Prime Minister, and this woman came on the phone. It was odd, and it was strange, and it was frightening that I was going to blow this thing. But my mind was very alert, and it was sort of thinking in a white light of clarity for the first time in my life, probably. And somebody wrote to me, thousands of people wrote Bob Geldof England letters. Most of them I dumped, but somebody wrote to me, and there was a quote in the letter from a guy called W.H. Murray, who I suppose later I thought was, if I thought about it, was some sort of Victorian educationalist. Anyway, what he wrote about, the idea of commitment, I kept it because it was so true. It explained almost everything that was happening to me, and that I needed to keep that clear line of commitment to what the end goal was going to be. That I pinned it up on the inside door of the cupboard in the kitchen. I work in the kitchen. I can't stand going to offices. And when I get confused about stuff, I'll open the cupboard and I'll read it. And it sorts you out again. And I bring it around with me too when I'm on the move. I'll read it to you now, if I can find it. It probably makes sense to you. This is what Murray says about commitment. Until one is committed, there is hesitancy, the chance to draw back, always ineffectiveness. Concerning all acts of initiative and creation, there is one elementary truth, the ignorance of which kills countless ideas and splendid plans. That the moment one definitely commits oneself, then providence moves too. A whole stream of events issues from the decision, raising in one's favor all manner of unforeseen incidents, meetings, and material assistance which no man could have dreamt would have come his way. And he finishes with a line from Goethe, the great German poet, which is equally true. Goethe says, whatever you can do or dream you can, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. That's true. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Anybody got any shades? Because
does anyone know what make Bob's suit is? Can you show us?
No.
Duchamp. Okay, so any questions?
Can you just hold up the boots? Come on, dude, please. I mean, the Topsy twins down here love them, but you know.
Okay, let's go to the front to Chris.
Hi there, so Bob. I'm Chris. one of the questions I want to ask is, obviously Live Aid and Band Aid had a massive impact at that time, but when you look at Africa now, it still has the problems that you were fighting to better when you had Band Aid and Live Aid. So what really has been the legacy of Band Aid and Live Aid, and what is it that we still need to do to better the problems that are in Africa?
Okay, thank you. The question was, what's been the legacy of Live Aid, because it looks like nothing's changed. Everything's changed. I think you're referring to the situation in the Horn of Africa right now. So the area that's affected now in the Horn of Africa is more or less the same area that was affected in 1984, 5, 6. What we didn't understand then was that there was a new phenomenon that got recognized about 4 years later in 1992 called climate change. So this area is got endemic drought. But a measure of how much things have improved, when we did Live Aid, and that 30 million people were affected. 30 million were about to die of hunger. That didn't happen, and it's boastful, but it's equally true that certainly hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, are alive now because of what you guys did in 84, 85, and 86. That's true. But the difference is that the areas affected in Kenya and Ethiopia, and they are affected, no one's dying of famine. Famine is occurring only in Somalia. They are deeply affected by the drought. They went on the move to find food and water. But because of what happened in the mid-80s, the international community immediately knew what was happening and put in shelter, housing, medicines, etc. But more importantly, the national governments of Kenya and Ethiopia are growing at such a fast pace economically that this year and last year, 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies of the world are African. Next year, 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are African, amongst them Ethiopia and Kenya, both growing at around 8 to 9%. Contrast that to the rest of the world economy. The fastest growing economy in the world is Ghana at 13%. So they've stabilized with growth. And so the national government, despite all the row about the ethnic rivalries and the ethnic fighting going on in Kenya, the government is coherent enough to be able to run the camps up in the north and to look after their own people. But much more importantly, as 1 million people flooded over the border from Somalia, they were able to absorb these completely different people, like as different as the Germans are to the French, completely absorb them within the space of 2 weeks and deal with this influx, this massive influx of humanity. Ethiopia, the same. There wasn't famine. We were able to get in there and deal with that. But more to the point, as famine pushes people into other areas where there are resources, these countries were able to take it, not only take it, but the country didn't destabilize. Now, imagine if suddenly 1 million Germans poured over the border into Britain, or 1 million Italians poured over the border into France, or 1 million French into Germany. We could take it, we could deal with it, but we want them sent straight back, and there'd be a lot of rows about a lot of stuff. That isn't occurring. The reason there's famine only in Somalia is because it's in a state of civil war. And so famine is a political problem. If there had been a coherent government in Mogadishu, you would have had the same situation as Kenya and Ethiopia. So in 25 years, the continent is now the fastest growing continent economically in the world. You get more returns out of Africa than any other district of investment or region in the world. That's not Geldof, that's the World Bank, McKinsey, and The Economist. If you put $1 into Unilever in the London Stock Exchange last year, you'd have returned $8.30 this year, or in New York the same. If you'd put that same dollar into Unilever Africa, you'd have got $23.80. I mean, it is through the roof, this continent. It's changed utterly. 3 things. 2005, you remember Live 8. Live 8 forced the G7 to do debt forgiveness, forgive the poorest countries. And all the arguments, if you do that, Bob, then there's nothing to stop them borrowing again, the moral hazard. Who's talking about moral hazard now as we're all chronically in debt and we're chronically trying to get them to forgive our debt? That's the Greek problem, it's the Irish problem, it's the Portuguese and Italian problem. Nobody's talking about moral hazard now, dude. Nobody's talking about the efficacy of aid because we're all on it. It's called quantitative easing. We just print money to keep ourselves stable. It's all a nonsense. As I say, it's a Ponzi scheme. But what we said was right. Give aid. You know, you can read all the counter-arguments in the Daily Mail. This fear, this visceral fear, I said, of property, that it so concerns us at the deepest human level. What is it the Daily Mail works off of? That fear. Cancer and property prices. Cancer causes houses to drop would be the classic Daily Mail piece of shit headline. So when they say that aid doesn't work, yes it does. And when Cameron says we're ring-fencing aid, we're ring-fencing health, it's smart. It's so tiny, the amount. And yet Britain, almost uniquely, are the only ones who've kept to their word. I cannot tell you the political buy-in that gets us. They used to just go straight to Brussels when they wanted to do their deals, or Beijing. The Africans, first stop London. And that's where we need to do the deals, believe me. So charity, the thing that you all helped with, absolutely central to us as people. If we don't see another hurt human being and recognize that pain and reach out and say, you know what, dude, let me give you a hand up there. If we don't put the pound or the Oxfam box or the euro, something essentially human withers and dies. When we do it, it stabilizes that individual that you saw hurt, and probably stabilizes their family. More importantly, when 1 million do it, it's political. 1 million votes, 1 million quid in that Oxfam box, whoa. When you bought Band-Aid, 8 million. That is deeply political. Suddenly this pop singer was cycling into Downing Street. So that's charity. Aid is kind of charity on the sovereign level. And it stabilizes not the individual and the family, but the community at a basic health, basic agriculture, basic education level. That's all it can do. But allowing that to stabilize should allow you to grow. Because between the government and the basic stabilized community is a void. That's called the economy. But if you can't grow into that, if there is no economy to grow into, if there's no traction, then you just get poverty the whole time. And the collateral damage of poverty is collapsed systems, which is why you say the governments there are rubbish, which is why you say there's corruption. Because if there's only 5 quid going around, you better grab some of it. So how do you make the economy function? What they do produce, you let them keep. When they all owed us 3p, which we didn't need and didn't even know they were owed to us, when we cancelled that, suddenly everything they produced didn't leave the country, it stayed in the country. And the economy began to grow because we kept them stable with the charity and the ODA. The Chinese needed raw materials to power that vast economy to suck their people out of poverty. The raw materials of the world are all in Africa. 90% of platinum and related materials and minerals are in Africa. You all have a piece of Africa right now in your pocket, or else the modern world doesn't work. It's called coltan. It's in your phones. It doesn't work. Those things, this thing, they don't work without coltan. 90% of coltan, Africa. Rare earths, 90%. 10% of all oil so far, Africa. 50% of gold, Africa. The Chinese needed that to power up. Massive investment. To get to the ports, they built the roads. And the people who steamed in with them were the people who'd always been there because the Brits had brought them in, the Indians. And the Indians brought skills and management. The Chinese invest And they don't care how much something costs, they'll always beat us. They beat us on speed and price, not corruption. The Chinese, if they run out of money, they go back to Big Daddy, the state, and they get more money to power the raw materials sector. The Indians can't go back to the state. They rely on themselves. So they integrate into African society, they teach Africans management skills, and they stay there. But between the two, the money and the skills, now you've got kickoff. Stabilizing the society, now you've got push-off. And the final trick, phones. After the Second World War, there was only 11 cities of 100,000 people in Africa. Africa, how do you think of it? How big is it? One country out of 53, one out of 53 is the size of Europe. One desert out of 6, one, is the size of the United States. It is vast. Russia, China, Europe, North, South America, Australia, drop into Africa and you wouldn't even notice the ripples. It's huge. 11 cities of 100,000 people with no roads. How could they possibly develop into hubs? New countries with no economy. Britain left Tanzania shamefully independent with 11 university students to run the place. What? But that's the way it was. They got there. And they got there because of stuff like Live Aid. The phone became the virtual infrastructure. You didn't need roads anymore, and it powered kids into the massive cities. Today, 52 cities of more than 1 million people, more than Russia, more than India, and the same as Europe. And what do they want? 17-year-olds, what do they want? Education, yes. Health, yes. Water, yes. Power, electricity, of course. They want Nikes and iPads, same as every other kid. And they're getting them. And they're inventing technologies we're going to use now. M-Pesa, electronic currency, 10% of the Kenyan economy goes through the mobile phone. Of this huge economy, 17 million people are banked on M-Pesa. M for mobile, Pesa means money in Swahili. They just pay for their bills with their phones. 10 days ago, Barclays introduced Ping It. You pay for everything with your phone using M-Pesa technology. So they're inventing technologies appropriate to themselves, which we will use. Why? Because they went from being a feudal society straight into the middle of the 21st century with the money to do it. We're 8 miles from them, 8 miles from Africa. Our get-out-of-jail card free is exporting to this massive place in 9 years, the largest workforce in the world, larger than India, larger than China, Africa. It's kick-off time. And with the PE fund, I want to help it go. It's the last bit of Bob's big adventure in Africa. I'm going to leave behind farms, firms, and factories, and the dignity of labor, and give people a go with their own money, which is what you do with property.
Thank you, Bob, Mr. Geldof. That was brilliant. I completely agree with you. As sort of entrepreneurs and landlords have a responsibility both to the community, the poor, and perhaps even the world. But what sort of practical advice would you offer sort of landlords and entrepreneurs here that can sort of help or make a difference to both domestically and internationally? What sort of practical advice?
The practical advice, I think, what's worked for me always is to be absolutely clear what it is you want. Clarity, real clarity, not let's try and do this thing and let's see, we're going here, guys. And then the ability to articulate it precisely so that people are excited by the idea and will come with the people you need to bind with you. And if that's coherent, you should be able to raise the funds to do it. And then absolute bravery. But, the Gandhi advice for anything is that sense of commitment. You must commit. as I say, everyone knows in their heart, unless you're, how many times do you say to your teenage kids, you know, are you serious about that? Are you serious about it? Do that. Sometimes it's frustrating, like I do a lot of television. I've got 6 TV companies, production companies. So a lot of the documentaries you see are made by these companies. I had a company called Planet 24. I don't know if you remember The Big Breakfast and The Word and those things, or if you've ever seen a reality show in America called Survivor. It's huge there. They were ours, and some of them still are. And then I went into documentary stuff. And last week I thought up an idea for a show. And I'm certain that the time is right for this idea. Certain. But the thing is, 4 guys decide if it's going to be made. BBC 1, 2, ITV, Channel 4. Nobody watches Channel 5, so it's pointless. And they'll just determine it. Now, I will go in and I'll pitch this thing. And like, in my head, they're just going to just hand me a check, you know, because like, you know, what don't you get? It's a no-brainer. Dude, you know, you're going to make a fortune. The Big Breakfast made good 40% of the advertising for Channel 4, and The Word, late at night, made a good 10%, because it was margins, on the margins where there's not much competition. This would be mainstream. I think it would work. I bet you I'll get, oh, I don't know, Bob, it's this. You know, fuck off. I've made more shows than you, I've had more hits than you, go away, you know, but that's not the game. So Survivor, you go to the BBC, you lay it out, and you know, you can see it, you can just see it. And they go, we're doing that already. No, they're not. You know, and 3 months later, out comes Castaway. Hello? And then ITV has a thing called I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, which is exactly the same. And we sued them. And the judge in New York said, the fact that they call themselves celebrities, even though you may never have heard them, I've never heard of any of them, distinguishes the idea from being just normal people in society. And that was enough to make that an original idea. But Survivor took off in 27 countries. You know, do you remember the Beyonce track, I'm a Survivor, and the Pontiac brothers? It was mega, and thank God. And BBC didn't get it. They did get it. They ripped it off, which they always do, and did their own version. Channel 4, ITV said it wasn't for their crowd. Channel 4 did some sort of alternative version. That's the thing. But all you can do is be coherent, be articulate, enthuse the people around you, and the key point, at the point where it all goes a bit incoherent, it's because your skills have run out. That there's a point where someone else must come into the frame, and you must allow them into that frame because they have skills that you don't have. And there needs to be that modesty at a certain point. You know, you now have 4 properties. It's all going great. But then there's some title deed problem, and there's a family kicking up, or like this house there, and you kind of go, man, you know. At which point, get someone in who can handle this stuff. I mean, I don't know if that happened with you. This guy you told me about, this Robin Hood character who handles, you know, sympathetically these families that you brought in on your action. I mean, they may not have had time to deal with this, but they found the guy who understood these people, who could get them out of a fix and the company out of a fix, maybe skills they didn't have. And that's really the cusp point. I know Branson very well. You know, I knew him from when he was a hippie and that. And Richard's very clever. He stands off. He always has this idea. And what he's done, of course, is create a brand, and he's amortized the brand across loads of people. Now come to him and say, can I call it this? Because you've got a trusted brand. But he kind of irons out the idea for people to say, we want to do this. And he kind of goes, gosh, I'm not sure that works, you know. And he sort of hippies around in his head and can feel what people want. And I think an entrepreneur has a sense and a feel of their moment. And the successful ones really, truly understand that and can articulate things that other people can't see. And that, to me, is the classic guy. This thing I'm doing in Washington, a mate of mine said I should see his cousin. And the cousin showed up, and I sat with him over a coffee, and he had this education technology called group call. I said, what does it do? And he said, well, group call, it can call lots of parents simultaneously if their kid doesn't check into school. It can call the authorities, etc. And my kids had just started going across London to school on the bus, and I was a bit worried about safety and that. And I just thought, I'm worried about safety for my kids, must be loads of kids, that'll work. What's the name? Group call. It just all worked perfectly. And so we got going, and that was 4 years, well, no longer now. And last year I won the Company of the Year in IT. I mean, they're amazing guys. And a 17-year-old has written the program that the Americans have bought, which is why I'm going over there now. A 17-year-old who dropped out of school at 13 wrote this mega school management system that the second biggest suppliers in America have just bought. That's Britain, and it's a fucking great place to be in if the banks would just give you the money to get going.
Okay. Bob, do we have time for one more? Yeah. Okay, we have time for one more question. We will go... Gentleman in the middle who put his hand up first. Looks like quite a... Yep, you, my friend. Yep, absolutely. This is the last question. Make it good. Don't ask him for money like last year. 2 people asked Lord Sugar for money. Please don't do that.
Wrong guy.
Yeah, it was.
Fabulous learning, Sir Bob. My name's Spike, and I host the Nottingham PIN meeting, a property meeting. And my question to you is, do you think property in the UK is still a sound investment, a great way to make money? Because you mentioned the precious metals in Africa. A lot of people are talking about putting money into things like gold because of all this quantitative easing, aka printing money.
Look, this is your game, and I would not presume to tell you. You study it, you feel it. I mean, you feel it, that's the point. That's why you're entrepreneurial in this area. You feel this is the way to go. You've sussed out areas that you look at if they're go. I'm engaged with it because my kids are at the point where they're trying to look around for places, you know, where they've been renting flats now and they can't see a point in that, and they're trying to get mortgages and all that stuff. So I'm engaged right in the middle of it. With regard to the growth, we're not going to stop the casino economy of property. We're just not. We vest too much of our personal and our financial interests, as I discussed earlier. Plus, there's the fact that we're seriously underhoused. Certainly London is, but also the rest of the country. The population is growing. What are the figures now? It's something like we'll be 70 million by 2025 or 2030. That's huge. We feel like it's a stuffed, crowded island. It isn't. But what we absolutely need is infrastructure. I can't stand the arguments about this high-speed rail. Build it. Build it. If you need to go underground, build a tunnel. It should link up to Newcastle and Edinburgh and down through Hull. I mean, I don't know if you're from Hull. God bless Hull, you know. I mean, it's tragic there. Like, this was once a huge, the most bombed city in Britain in the war, from which they never recovered, you know. But people do need jobs. We will create an economy. You guys have to imagine, what will that economy be? Will it just be manufacturing? I don't think so, because we can't compete with India and China in manufacturing. So the key issue is we will have to go to education. Our children need to be educated at a very, very high level indeed. There is a natural genius. I'm a Paddy, so stand advised. There's a natural genius to this country. Entirely creative. I mean, seriously, I mean, you know, I've traveled the world for many, many years. This is, without question, the most dynamically creative country around. And maybe because it's so stuffed and crowded, maybe it's this beehive community of constantly, like, you know, touching antlers and ideas sparking. What we're not great at is monetizing that, and that's because there isn't an economy to monetize into. If the Americans invent the phone, there's 360 million of them to sell it to. You know, we also have a sort of modesty about it, which we should never lose. And there's this giant mix of cultures in this country, which there always has been. Never mind the fucking Daily Mail. There always has been. It is, you know, mongrels are the strongest dogs in the park. And, you know, this place is a constant influx of Celts and Picts and Romans and Gauls and Vikings and Anglo-Saxons and whatever, constantly. What was it like during Ethelred the Unready? No wonder he was fucking unready. He didn't understand a word the other fuckers were saying, you know. I mean, literally, what was it like? I mean, here was everyone with a completely different language. We know what the languages were, all banging up against each other. And I'm sure they lived next door to each other. They said, look, dude, you know what? You do your thing and I'll do mine. I'll say good morning in the morning and let's leave it at that. So I'm sure they left their house, morning Ethelred, morning Canute, you know, or whatever. And this culture of sort of tolerance and respect, and never mind the fact that there was no dogs, no blacks or Irish, it's bollocks. That isn't what happens au fond. It is an incredibly tolerant society. I don't have a black skin, so it's not as apparent to me, maybe. But I've never had the Irish thing, and if I have, it didn't bother me. But I've lived in many places in the world. I've been around the world 3 times a year. Gets tiring. Here, I choose to live here. I choose specifically London, which we discussed upstairs. Just, I love it. I love it. It's the culture of ideas that constantly, you just have an idea, you can get it going here. And as for the country, the more ideas, the better. And this constant mix of accepted cultures coming in promotes vast ideas. We need to monetize it. We can't while the banks stifle us. In terms of property, this vast, swelling, moving population will need a place to live, will need a place to be. A place to be. That's what home is. That thing is just solid material concrete. But what is in there is a place to be, a place to live. And we desire that above everything else, just to be. To live, to love, to hate, to fight, to die. So, will there be property? Forever. Is the population growing? Yes. Can we afford that population? Yes. Will they need housing? Absolutely. Does it have to be shit housing? No. Do we have to respect the people who don't have the money, who try to find a place to be? Yes, we do. Do we support them? Yes, because their children will be the guys who do it tomorrow. So is there an answer to the question? Yeah. Is property the place to go for the immediate term? That's for all you guys to answer. But I would imagine there's a reason why it keeps going up. 1, construction is down, so you get short housing stock. The green belt constrains housing. The economy outside of London is 0. But it shouldn't remain that way, particularly if we build the infrastructure that gathers everyone into an economic centre. And at that point, will housing take off? Yes, because there'll be so many workers employed in infrastructure that they'll have cash to spend. What do they want? A better place. Their families, their wives will drive them to that. Women determine the housing. So would I get into property now? I don't know. I just know my kids are. And they keep asking me, Dad, will it go up? Will it go up? I don't know, because they're putting their lives on the line. Like, you know, it's not as if I write them a check or anything. So they're out there. Would I do it if I was you? My mate who comes with me on this stuff, Mark, he said he should always have done property, you know, and now when he thinks about doing it, he says it won't go up, it won't go up. It's always gone up, but things always come down too. Buy well, buy cheap, sell dear. I didn't invent that. No.
Please stand up. Okay. One more time.
Thanks, everyone.